Let's start with the news from over the weekend. Here's the headline from Saturday's Washington Post. Pure madness. Dark days inside the White House as Trump shocks and rages. Very cool. Also CNN. The great unraveling. Trump's allies are worried about him. Politico. Demoralized West Wing stokes fears of Trump's capacity to handle a crisis. And USA Today just went with King Chaos. Guys, happy Monday. Who thinks we're all going to die?
Not good. It's not good.
So I felt like there was a quote in the Politico story that I thought was instructive about this moment.
Okay.
It says, administration officials and outsiders with windows into decision-making describe a growing sense of despair within Trump's ranks.
Oh, I wrote that one down.
Driven by the mounting realization that the president's brand of politics, guided by intuition and improvisation, is incompatible with a competently functioning executive branch. Most alarming by these lights is mounting evidence that Trump lacks an attribute possessed by most previous presidents and certainly by all most successful ones, a capacity for self-critique and self-correction. Fuck that. That has been true for a year and a half. Who is learning that this week?
Okay, so let's start. So I had that quote towards the end of this section, but let's start there because my question was going to be, should we do one more round of why doesn't anyone else fucking quit in protest then?
This is similar to Republicans learning things from this most recent mass shooting as if there's something to learn from the 40th of something. Not only have we known these qualities of Trump, we went through a Mad King cycle like 6 months ago.
I know. Well, what's different about this time? It does seem like all these reporters who talk to all these liars in the White House, so even though their reporting is good, who knows if it's true or not because these people lie to them all the time. All these reporters are like, it is worse than we've ever seen. The morale is low. It's demoralized. Like, what's new about this time? I don't understand.
I'm not sure. I mean, there's the constant Game of Thrones stuff with his staff. And Gary Cohn is apparently so upset he might now leave because Trump siding with the white supremacists and Nazis in Charlottesville didn't do it, but tariffs might. So that's what's getting him upset.
If you want to know what the line is for Gary Cohn and Paul Ryan, it's tariffs. It's not good people on both sides. It's tariffs.
It's not obstructing of justice on NBC. It's
right. It's tariffs. And so he's lost 2 close aides. Okay, so he lost Keith Schiller, who was his bodyguard, and no one knows what the guy actually did. He lost Hope Hicks, who is basically an enabler / communications director who sort of tells him what he needs to hear. So, okay, maybe he's lost some friends in the building and he's more sad. But, my fear about his mental capacity is unchanged based on these machinations internally. And I always think about how they haven't faced a real crisis yet. I mean, the Obama years, there's a few off the top of my head. Ebola, the oil spill, like the Christmas Day bomber. And then there's all these crises that are happening that they just don't care about, like a genocide in Burma. Normally a U.S. government would actually care about that, or slaughter in Syria. So 800,000 DACA recipients getting kicked out of crisis they created. So, I mean, certainly we know that he has no capacity for self-reflection. He doesn't seem to actually care about the job. He cares about cable news hits and how he looks vis-a-vis Fox News. But, yeah, I don't really get what's new here either.
I just can't believe we can't find one person in that fucking administration, except for Omarosa leaving and talking about it on Big Brother, who will leave that White House and not on background publicly say, things are really fucked up in there, and it's pretty dangerous.
Hey,
and Congress, you better fucking do something.
I remember this person named Dina Powell.
Isn't Dina free now?
Where's Dina?
Oh, she's back at Goldman Sachs.
Never
so
said a fucking word. Dina, you didn't say a fucking word.
No.
You sold out your country, and you didn't say a fucking word.
Glowing profiles as she walked out the door, though. I'm sure Gary Cohn will get the same thing.
He's
in the same category as her.
We look forward to you telling people to tell us that this bothers you.
And Ryan's
talk about what happened inside the building, Dina.
Ryan's too. Like, he sort of flirts with talking about how difficult and challenging it was, but he doesn't have the guts to actually say anything. Bannon is clearly a source in a ton of these stories, right? Like, he's one of like 8 or 9 people on a witness list that are getting subpoenaed all these documents from Mueller, and lo and behold, that leaks to Axios. What a surprise. So, I mean, look, I'm speculating on sourcing here, but Bannon is pushing his own agenda in the guise of truth-telling. But you're right, and there's no one's lighting themselves on fire.
One other thing in that Washington Post story that was just hilarious was Trump says he thinks the American people are finally starting to conclude that the Democrats, as opposed to his campaign, colluded with the Russians. Keep thinking, buddy. I don't think that is true. But that is a result of just being in the Fox News cocoon, right? And only if you only watched Fox and Friends, you would of course conclude that the American people now believe that it was Democrats who colluded with Russia. I mean, it's such a ridiculous thing for anyone to think, let alone the president of the United States. Like, maybe he really doesn't know. All these times we think, oh, he's doing this because he's worried that Mueller's closing in, blah, blah. Maybe he doesn't really know how much trouble he's in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's possible. He's lied to himself, you know?
Look, undergirding all these stories, these Mad King stories, is the real dark fear of Trump doing something catastrophic. You know, the result of this episode of him being in a funk is these, you know, self-destructive steel and aluminum tariffs.
Right.
Survivable. There are even some Democrats who say it's not a bad idea. Whatever. Obviously it's a terribly made policy and the process is terrible, but it's survivable. And I guess the question I always come back to when I read these stories is, you know, the president isn't like sitting at the center of the earth pulling various levers. Everything he wants to do, he activates through the people that are around him. And implicit in all these stories is this guy's going to do something so dangerous and we don't know if we can stop it. And again, it comes down to the people that are around Donald Trump, the Kellys, the McMasters, the Cohns, all of them. What are you trying to tell us? Will you stop it? Are you going to protect us from this guy?
Yeah.
Or are you just trying to cover your own asses?
Well, but you know, the scandals of the moment cover up these massive problems he's created. I mean, he created a rupture with Mexico by adhering to this promise that Mexico would pay for the wall, a promise that only he believed. And in polling, people don't really care about. They don't
Even
believe
his supporters didn't believe it.
The Trump supporters don't care that much about the wall. They don't really think Mexico is going to pay for it. But there's this massive cost in terms of our economic and security relationship with one of our biggest trading partners and allies, like on our border, and it's just exploded. It's exploded that relationship.
I wanted to ask you, Tommy, because how unusual because I think that the process of what happened with the steel and aluminum tariffs, even if it's a survivable policy, the process of how he made that decision was so incredibly fucked up, and I don't think people realize how screwed up. It's like, this was, for something that's involves tariffs like this, it's got to be a national security process and an economic process. It probably involves state, it probably involves Defense Department, it probably involves Treasury. Like, what's a normal process like for coming to a big decision like that?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those issues that cuts across national security and economic lines. So it would generally be run through the NSC, I think, with economic team input, because they invoked what's called Section 232, which is a trade law that says you can restrict imports if those imports pose a threat to national security. So the first challenge here is that it's rarely used provision. In this instance, it's completely ridiculous and imperfect. Like, he wants to rail against China and hit them for dumping a bunch of steel into the market. But the people he's actually hurting, like the top importers of steel, are Canada, Germany, Turkey, a bunch of NATO allies. So he's hurting all these allies and friends who we should be working with to put more pressure on China in the guise of hurting China. So he's completely fucked this up. The process was so... it was apparently just like Wilbur Ross and this guy Peter Navarro barking at Trump in the Oval Office.
That's it, two people.
An end run around the rest of the national security establishment because Mattis is opposed to it. It sounds like the whole economic team is opposed to it.
And I can't imagine making a decision that momentous, talking to two people in the federal government, ignoring everyone else, not telling everyone else, not informing the rest of the federal government. They didn't even get to give our allies a heads up that this was coming. I mean, this is just like...
and landing on the numbers because they're round and sound good.
Yes. Which he always loves.
Loves a round number.
Because they sell. So yeah, it's a 25% tariff on imported steel, a 10% tariff on imported aluminum. Question on, is this a good policy? We should talk about this. So... we want to have a strong American steel and aluminum industry, and too much cheap foreign steel and aluminum, mostly from China, is hurting our industry. I think this is what some people are responding to, some of these Democrats too. But this tariff that Trump is planning on imposing hits every country, including our allies, and it will basically do little to nothing to stop China from producing so much steel and dumping it. But it's gonna cause all these countries to retaliate, and so now you have European countries saying we're gonna start taxing bourbon and jeans and Harley Davidsons, and then in response to Europe saying that, Trump starts tweeting, well, then we'll start taxing foreign cars that come into the country
Exactly.
from Europe.
Taxing
and then he's like,
Harley Davidsons. What are these midlife crisis 55-year-old guys going to get in Germany?
in Germany, yeah. What are they going to do?
What are they going to do?
They're not going to wear their jeans. They're not going to drink their bourbon.
You got to hand it to the Europeans. Like, that is a pretty impressive little thing to have in your back pocket. Okay, Harley Davidson's Paul Ryan, bourbon Mitch McConnell. They stuck it
I
to
didn't think about
exactly
that.
the right people in the Republican Congress.
But this is, and you heard the head of the EU say this. He's like, fine, he's going to do this. He was going to act stupid. We can act stupid too. We're all going to act stupid now because that's what trade wars are. No one ever wins. Trump tweeted this weekend, trade wars are good. They can be easily won. They've actually never been won. What ends up happening in a trade war is eventually all the countries figure out how to de-escalate, so it all goes back to normal.
Or like
no one actually wins this.
Or World War I or something.
But generally, more companies in the U.S. use steel to make stuff than make steel itself. So it's likely this will hurt a bunch of U.S. industries. And you're seeing it reflected in the stock market. You're seeing CEOs express concern they're going to have to raise the price on like household objects like cans for soda or whatever. And you have Wilbur Ross as Secretary of Commerce. He's this 81-year-old billionaire schmo going on TV and holding up Coke cans and Budweiser cans, talking about how little it will hurt people. And it's just the worst messaging, the worst policy, the worst optics I could possibly imagine from these guys. And it's so half-assed.
Yeah, I mean, and this is like, I think one of the beer companies said this. They're like, look, we first buy as much American aluminum as possible, but demand is so great that there's not enough made in America, so we have to buy foreign aluminum. And now we're just going to have to, there's going to be higher costs where it's going to be passed on to the consumer, and people are just going to pay a little bit more. And the Trump administration, their basic argument is, yeah, people are going to have to pay more, but like not too much more.
Yeah, we don't care. That's sort of their
Like
response.
not too much more, so it's probably fine. Now the question is like, what do we do about China like dumping too much foreign steel in the country? Because it is a problem. You see, like Sherrod Brown was supportive of this, Bob Casey. But I think you work with our allies through the World Trade Organization to sort of bring a case against China.
I mean, you don't piss off the whole world is step one. Step two, you can go to the WTO and work with our allies there. You could, you could have conversations with a Secretary of State that works with the Europeans or the Brazilians or others who might actually align with us here, who would like to actually blunt the impact from China. Like, we brought cases against China at the WTO, and the Trump administration has not followed through on those cases that were designed to deal with these specific issues.
Yeah, and that's the key. It's like we need to work with the rest of the world to isolate China as a bad actor on steel, and now we are isolated from the rest of the world because we have just imposed tariffs on everyone.
Yeah, and there's a larger problem, I think, even inside of democratic politics around how we talk about trade and what our views on trade are. International trade, open economies are policies that have diffuse benefits and acute harms, right? That when you allow for importation of whatever products, the places that made it in the U.S. may suffer, but on the whole, the economy does better. And I think that is a source of tension in democratic politics that we actually have not resolved. I don't know what the Democratic position on trade is when you get from the Bernie Sanders wing of the party to the more free trade wing of the party. And I think even in our language about how we talk about it, how we talk about domestic manufacturing, how we talk about supporting U.S. industry versus other countries and free trade, I actually don't think we have a good language for it.
Bush tried this in 2002. He imposed tariffs of up to 30%, and they didn't last because they were worried about retaliation. But then there was a study that found that the steel prices cost more jobs than the number of people employed in the industry at the time. This, according to the New York Times, I believe. So, it doesn't feel like there's a good argument for this. I know Sherrod Brown is out in support because they have steel manufacturers in his district, and so there's going to be some NIMBYism on all these issues. But I think writ large, folks think this was a bad policy, poorly implemented.
Well, certainly in this
I don't even
case.
think most
That's because
unions
it was
support it.
made and implemented in a Fox News rage.
Yeah.
but it is being made in the context of Donald Trump tapping into something about trade. The trade and immigration were the two places where he found an opening, and it was an opening not just in the Republican Party, it was an opening in both parties because if you on trade, on immigration, where the both parties were before Donald Trump got in the race were quite similar.
Yeah, but
on
again,
the whole.
it's such typical Donald Trump. It's like the easy part is identifying that globalization and trade has hollowed out the middle class in a lot of our industries. The hard part is figuring out what the fuck to do about it, and that's why you have until you bring people together and have policy.
His favorite thing is to identify a real source of political anger and outrage and then make it worse. I mean,
Exactly.
That's what he does.